Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 2 of my Star Trek, the original series episode breakdown video series. In this video I'll be looking at Season 1 episodes 7 to 12 of Star Trek the original series or generation to identify historical references which can be used to determine the original history of the Star Trek universe. The episode order I'm using is the production order. In order to understand the development of the history or vision, we need to study the episodes in the order they were written. While I'm uncertain of the exact writing order, the production order is about as close as I can confirm. The episode order information as broadcast is also included. Special thanks to the transcripts which can be found on the Chakotay site. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek back in 1966, he had a vision which remained basically consistent over the following 3 years. The animated series and early movies retained this consistency in the most part. When The Next Generation was released in 1987, Gene's vision had changed and the past needed to change in order to be consistent with his new vision. This video series will look at the original vision of Star Trek, starting with the earliest source material. Any historical facts from later sources which contradict the earlier references must be assumed to be an error. Minor changes in nomenclature can be excused. The Naked Time is the 4th episode of Season 1. It was the 7th episode produced. We discover in this episode planet s1e02, which was once like Earth but is now disintegrating. In this episode, we discover that Vulcan men treat their Vulcan women strangely. What exactly this means is unknown, but it's probably best the details aren't provided. While Spock is a logical person, when his logic is broken down and his emotions bubble up, he speaks of his human mother with some level of regret. In order to escape the collapsing planet, the Enterprise accelerates away and enters time warp, where the Enterprise regresses in time. They went back into time by 3 days. This will be used in a couple of other episodes as we move forward in the series. The main piece of information in this episode is the Enterprise discovers how to travel back into time, at least in principle. They use a different method to travel back into time the next time they attempt this, but this may be setting up a method to go back into our time for other episodes. The other piece of information is concerning Vulcans, with Spock showing the Vulcans have deep emotion but suppress them rather than them not having any emotions at all. The other bit of info is the way Vulcan men treat their women, but the look in Nurse Chapel's eyes, or based on that look, I expect this would be considered rough copulation. In many ways, I would prefer not to know the details. Charlie X is the 2nd episode of Season 1. It was the 8th episode produced. We discover another spacecraft, Antares, which is a cargo vessel with a crew of 20. We also discover another planet, Colony 5, which has relatives of Charlie living on it. As Charlie is human, or was, then the relatives are human, and this must be a human colony. Charlie was marooned on Thasus for 14 years, which means he got there in 2250. Thasus is inhabited by, guess what? Thatians. The Thatians do not have corporeal form, which they abandoned centuries ago. This can be no later than 2064 and is probably much earlier, but let's stay with the 2064 for this episode anyway, or this series. My actual guess is it probably takes several million, if not a billion years to achieve this state. Charlie was on a transport ship which crashed on Thasus 5. The name and type is unknown. Harry Mudd used a transport ship, so it may have been similar. This is shown on the bottom left. This episode mentions for the first time some form of headquarters. Earlier episodes mentions Earth Base, but now we have an organisation called UESPA. It's assumed this means United Earth Space Probe Agency, but I'm certain where this comes from, at least at this point. The takeaways from this episode is the Earth sector has regular cargo routes using cargo ships like the Antares, which have schedules and organised routes. The Antares is an Earth ship because the captain is human, and a North organisation reports its destruction. Another colony planet is mentioned, Colony 5. It's logical that there are 4 other colony planets, each colony, or called Colony 1 to 4. It's possible these names were given because they were the first colonies of Earth, or perhaps they represent a group of colonies, or there are 5 habitable planets in a single system and it's easy to name them from 1 to 5. There could be more than 5 colonies as well. It's possible Earth names its colonies by numbers as well as names, similar to the way military formations or even the Enterprise, which has both a number and a name. Other sources also call this Alpha Colony 5, which may mean it's a colony around Alpha Centauri. Thasus is an uninhabited planet, at least by human standards, which cannot support corporeal life. It must be in human-controlled space, as why would a cargo ship be passing it otherwise? There are non-corporeal life forms on the planet which were corporeal in the past. Charlie was on a transport ship when he was marooned on Thasus. This must be different from a cargo ship, but what that difference is not explained. The UESPA is mentioned, which implies there is some form of centralized headquarters. It's assumed this means United Earth Space Probe Agency, but I'm uncertain where this comes from. This organisation records ships being destroyed and reports this information to other ships. As the Antares and Enterprise are Earth ships, the organisation must be an Earth organisation. It's most likely this is what became Starfleet. But a better theory, which would avoid any other issues, is that it's actually a sub-organisation of Starfleet and may monitor movements of all ships, military or civilian. Balance of Terror is the 14th episode of the first season. It was the 9th episode produced. The Romulans are introduced for the first time in this episode, as well as the planets Romulus and Remus. While the capital planet of the Romulan star empire is Romulus, the map shows a second planet called Romi. Kirk named a second planet as well, Remus. The theory is the Romi system has a second name, which was Remus. Another theory is both are separate planets or systems. Based on the map, we can assume they are systems and not just planets orbiting a single star. There are many other smaller systems in the Romulan star empire, but no mention is made of these and they have no names. They could be comparatively minor planets or systems. Spock provides an overview of the war in this episode. As you may recall from your histories, this conflict was fought by our standards today with primitive atomic weapons and in primitive space vessels, which allowed no quarter, no captives, nor was there even any ship-to-ship visual communication. There is no mention of the Federation. It was an Earth against Romulan war. Allies are mentioned. The conflict was a draw of some description. Perhaps both sides were exhausted or saw no point in continuing the conflict. Romulan ships from the past war are described as follows. They're painted like a giant bird of prey. We are informed about an invisibility capability for the Romulan ships, or cloaking, by Spock. This was previously unknown by the Federation, so represents a new technology. The ship is the flagship of the Praetor fleet. One definition of Praetor is the commander of the army, so this could mean the entire Romulan fleet. During the Earth-Romulan War, no one from Earth ever saw a Romulan. Spock also mentions there were allies involved in the war, but how many or on whose side, this is unknown. Because of an error on the Romulan side, the Enterprise gets a view of an actual Romulan, and he looks like a Vulcan. The Romulans have a strong Roman feel to them. One sub-commander is called Decius, and he sends a message to the Praetor. Both are Latin words. Spock also informs us of an Earth's aggressive colonial period. The reference could be referring to Earth prior to spaceflight or after spaceflight. I assume before. We also know the Vulcans had an aggressive colonizing period. As there seems to be very few Vulcan colonies, I assume this phase occurred before the Vulcans had spaceflight as well. While there is no mention of the Federation, Starfleet, deflector shields, or proton torpedoes, this could be an omission. We can assume they may exist or may not exist. Well, certainly the weapons exist. The Romulans' main planets are Romulus and Remus, and Romi being the third planet or another name for Remus. These could also represent separate systems, and Romi must be a separate system based on the star map. The Romulans have a star empire, so there must be more planets or systems in the empire. The star map shows many more systems which are unnamed. The Romulans look like Vulcans, so are related in some manner. Spock states they are an offshoot, I expect because he knows Vulcan history to its formation. So the Vulcans could not be an offshoot of the Romulans, it was the other way around. There is a neutral zone between the Romulan star empire and Earth's territory. The star map shows 7 outposts guarding the neutral zone. There are probably many more outside of this map. There was a war between Earth and the Romulans a century ago. The estimation is the war occurred about 2150. While there may have been a federation at the time, the mention of the war being Earth-Romulan and the inclusion of allies strongly implies there was no federation. Based on this, the Federation was formed about 2161. The 5-year mission spans 2264 to 2269. The Romulans possess only impulse power, while the Enterprise has superior drive, warp drive. It's unknown what the link between impulse power and impulse drive is, but there may be a relationship. We know that the Enterprise warp drive is faster than their Romulan impulse drive. It's estimated Zefram Cochrane invents warp drive around 2061. This is before the Earth-Romulan War, so Earth must have had warp drive during this conflict, with the Romulans possibly using a type of impulse drive which also allowed for faster-than-light travel. Impulse drive is supposed to be sublight, at least that's what I thought, but the Romulan ships had travelled at least 4 light years, assuming the grid shows 1 light year increments, which is about the smallest you could have, considering the other systems shown. As a result, the Romulan impulse power must allow for faster-than-light speed travel. This may have been less effective than warp drive, so Earth only uses a type of impulse drive for sub-light travel only because, after all, they have warp drive, so why do they need FTL impulse drive? It's also possible impulse drive power has nothing to do with impulse drive, and it's an inferior version of a dilithium-based power source. I suspect this is the actual situation. The conclusion is the Enterprise has a superior power system and superior faster-than-light drive. The Romulan advantage is its cloaking technology and superior weapon. What a Little Girl's Made Of is the 7th episode of the first season. It was the 10th episode produced. Another ancient or fallen civilization is disclosed, this time on the planet Orion. In this case, the civilization had superior medical technology. The year is a guess, but it's probably after the civilization on M113 collapsed and before Landru created his static society. I could be totally wrong, but until I find other evidence, this is a good working hypothesis, and that's what I'll be working on, or working with. The Enterprise is at XO3. This is a dying planet which once contained an ancient technological civilization. Due to the cooling surface, the inhabitants go underground, and now only their underground facilities remain. We do not know when the civilization dies, but as the Thalosians were about to become extinct after 200,000 years underground, a date 200,000 years before seems reasonable, if not more. On the other hand, they became extinct because of their androids, so the date could be closer to 100,000 BC. In my case, I'm going to run with the 200,000 BC they became extinct. XO3 was explored by Corby at least 5 years ago, if not more. 2 more expeditions arrived in the 5-year period but found nothing. It seems that warp can be measured in fractions, in this case 0.07. An impulse deck is mentioned afterwards, which seems to imply they are related. This is not very significant, but may contain or confirm that impulse drive is a type of warp. Impulse is low efficiency, slower, inferior to proper warp drive, but related nonetheless. As mentioned earlier, the early Earth ships and Romulans used impulse to move, and this must be a faster-than-light travel to make any sense. We also discovered the civilization on XO3 created androids before the inhabitants died out. Were the 2 events linked somehow? Another colony planet is mentioned, this time Colony 2, very innovative name. We know there is a Colony 5 from an earlier episode, so this confirms there must be a Colony 1 to Colony 5. It's possible that they are all at Alpha Centauri or something similar. We also get another planet which is mentioned, in this case Midas 5, which is a small colony. Very little significant historical information is covered in this episode. We find at least 2 more colony planets, both of which must be Earth colonies. 2 uninhabited planets, which once had civilizations on them, are also mentioned. The one interesting point is the lack of aliens. This episode only has a single alien android in it. Everyone else, apart from Spock, is human. The 2 alien planets mentioned are both dead. While the Enterprise may be on the frontier of human territory, it's spending most of its time in Earth-controlled space dealing with humans. This looks and feels like an Earth empire or federation. A quick point about the aliens. As the androids made a copy, then the alien android must be what the aliens actually looked like. I wonder where this particular android was modelled, or how this particular android was modelled. Perhaps Corby had a sort of a magazine with a picture of a woman in it, perhaps. Dagger of the Mind is the 9th episode of the first season. It was the 11th episode produced. We discover in this episode that teleportation can be stopped using a security force field of some description. We also discover the Earth Federation has crime and penal colonies. In this case, the penal colony occupies a whole planet and appears to be otherwise uninhabited. We discover the Vulcans have the ability to probe other Vulcan minds, and it appears human minds, even though there is some risk associated with it. Spock indicates that Vulcan does not have violent crime because everyone suppresses emotion or has no emotion. As a result, there are no Vulcan prisoners, at least of violent crime. I assume there's still some criminal activity which is not emotion-based, that may be greed-based. The term Warp Factor 1 is used in this episode. The world of Star Trek contains criminals and penal colonies. However, we never discover what crimes the inmates have committed, although based on Spock's comments, they are most likely a violent crime. We only ever see 2 inmates. One inmate, Leith, is an assistant, and the other inmate is being treated. We discover Vulcan has no violent crime due to lack of the control or lack of emotion, thus no need for prisons, theoretically. The key takeaway is Vulcan has no prisons, but I'm uncertain that crime and violence, or I'm certain crime and violence is possible even if emotions were controlled, so there may be an alternative to prison. On the other hand, perhaps a logical mind would assume that violence, where you can be caught, makes no sense, so any violent crime is done in a manner which means it can never be discovered. Thus it exists, it's just never discovered. But then, with a mind probe, no secrets are possible, so we have to assume Vulcan has no prisons and no violent crime. I wonder if there are police. As I indicated earlier, there must be other criminal activities such as stealing, etc., which is not emotion-based, so maybe the Vulcans deal with them in a different way rather than prisons. This is the first use of the Vulcan mind meld or probe. We discover Spock has never used it on a human before, and it's very private. Miri is the 8th episode of the first season. It was the 12th episode produced. The Enterprise finds a planet which is a duplicate of Earth, specifically 1960 Earth. To be clear, the technology on the planet is 1960 era, which is when the civilization collapsed. The planet is beyond the area explored by Earth vessels, at least up in this point. Civilization on this planet collapsed 300 years prior, which makes it 1964, if compared with our Earth here. This is not specifically important, but makes the planet more of an identical copy of our Earth. In 1964, both planets were identical, the only difference being that this planet went belly up shortly afterwards. This other Earth attempts to develop a virus which could extend human life, but it went very wrong. The disease does not affect Spock. The inhabitants of the planet are humanoid, which means the planet is a close copy of the original Earth in all its detail. As the Enterprise crew is affected by the virus, biologically they must be incredibly similar, if not maybe even identical. Very strange. Kirk mentions in this episode a Space Central, which sounds like a version of Starfleet. The most interesting point raised in this episode is the copy of the Earth. This is not a scientific impossibility, and many scientists feel that it could be possible to find duplicate Earths out in space. But in their theories, the planets would be so far away as to be unreachable. In this episode, the duplicate is close enough to reach, which, while being implausible, highly implausible, is not impossible based on our understanding of science and the universe today and probability. There are few survivors left on the planet, so once the disease is cured and the planet starts moving forward again, it will have minimal impact on the Earth Federation. Space Command is sending people to assist the planet, so it's logical to assume this will become another, rather valuable, colony of Earth. The episode mentions Space Command. It's possible this is Starfleet. While UESPA headquarters is mentioned in an earlier episode, it would be easier to believe that that was a sub-department of Starfleet rather than Starfleet itself. It's possible all three organisations are the same. As mentioned before, nomenclatures can change as the episodes progress, and the optimal name for a technology such as dilithium or an organisation such as Starfleet is fully or finally defined. According to Wiki, Starfleet Command is the headquarters command centre of Starfleet, which seems reasonable. The dates of the 5-year mission are often taken from this episode, with civilization on this planet collapsing 300 years prior, which makes it 22 or 1960 if compared with our Earth. The problem is we do not know when civilization collapsed, so it's only a vague guide to the actual year. Many of the latter Star Trek movies and shows do not align with the original vision of the series. This is common in real history, as later historians attempt to change the past to justify their beliefs in the present. As I personally enjoyed the original vision of Star Trek, I would hope future material would come back to its original roots. However, I probably doubt that will ever happen. And so this concludes episode 2 of my Star Trek, the original series episode breakdown video series, in this case covering season 1, episodes 7 to 12.